My name is Willie Martin, and I serve as a deacon in the Pacific Southwest District of the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod. And as there has been quite a bit of discussion concerning the role of deacons within the church, we thought it would be advantageous to ask somebody who has been involved in this for a number of years, that being the Reverend Dr. John Yeatus. And we'll ask him a few questions here today. Number one, shouldn't the ministry of deacons focus on serving the needy people? The 7 in Acts 6 were appointed to do so.
You know, that verse in Acts 6 is the thing that's most often seen or discussed in the service of deacons. But if you look closely at that passage, what you'll notice is that they aren't called to serve the needy, namely the widows. Rather, they're called to solve the problem of disunity. There's factions forming between the Greek speakers on one hand and the Hebrew on the other. And as anyone knows who has to deal with disunity and conflict in the church, it's very difficult to handle. It's more than just serving the poor or the needy. And so they're selected to do this. By the way, the conflict between the Gentile community and the Hebrew community is one that the church has to address repeatedly throughout the book of Acts and then in the epistles as well. And so Philip and Stephen and the others address very directly for the first time that struggle. And then we see the apostles doing the same thing later. It's also important to notice what kinds of things Philip and Stephen do in following chapters. It describes their ministry in some detail, but not one story deals with serving the needy. Instead, it's Stephen who preaches the gospel to the synagogue and then later defends the faith in front of the Sanhedrin. It's Philip who takes the gospel to the Samaritans, does great healings in the name of the Lord, and even baptizes. And he does this without the direction or even the knowledge, it seems, of the apostles, because Peter is then sent later in order to see what he's done. And so it's important to notice the ministry of these deacons in Acts 6 and following really has nothing to do with serving the needy, but instead has great spiritual impact on the people who hear them.
Why are the biblical qualifications of overseers and deacons so strict?
1 Timothy 3 lists qualifications for overseers. We see those as pastors today, and deacons, and they are very similar lists. They don't focus on skills, rather they focus on spiritual maturity and character. And those lists are very similar because spiritual ministry in the church is primarily forming the character and faith of a person, not just teaching them something. And so because both overseers and deacons work in partnership, they need to have a very similar kind of Christ-like character in order to help believers attain that same kind of character in their lives. Now, what's also important is that other offices, for instance, evangelist and prophet, do not have similar lists of strict qualifications for them, which suggests that the ministry of overseers and deacons are a close partnership with a very similar kind of ministry, which is perhaps also why they're mentioned together in Philippians 1:1.
If deacons are doing all sort of pastoral ministry, isn't the church inferring that they are one and the same?
You know, congregations that have both pastors and deacons have no trouble distinguishing between the two. Now, the primary difference between overseer or pastor and deacon is actually in that name. Overseer is the name or title that's normally used in the New Testament, particularly in the book of Acts. That indicates that the ministry of pastors is really about overseeing the ministry and the spiritual life of the people in that particular congregation. Deacons serve in association with pastors, but without that unique ministry of oversight. Now, it's also important to notice that when a substitute pastor or clergy comes into a church, say to substitute preach for a pastor, certainly the pastor realizes that he's not transferring his ministry of oversight to that other clergy even for a moment. So pastors intuitively realize that oversight is the central part of what they do, whether they are there every Sunday or when they aren't, when they're preaching and when they aren't. So oversight is that central distinguishing feature of pastors.
Aren't you denigrating the office of the holy ministry by saying that anyone can become a pastor after a few short classes?
It's inaccurate and unfair to say that the training of deacons is somehow shoddy and produces inept ministers. The Ministry of Deacons is taken seriously, and the classes describe that. Also, the teachers of the deacon classes are frequently professors at universities, Concordia universities, as well as experienced pastors. And I, for one, have been teaching some 17 years, which gives a lot of experience, and have about 35 years experience as a pastor, as well as a doctorate. So certainly those who are training deacons have experience in training as well as in ministry, and so can prepare them well for the ministry of deacons. However, it's important to remember these classes aren't designed to train them to be the equivalent of pastors, but rather the training classes is for deacons, not clergy classes.
Why do you want to replace pastors with poorly trained wannabes?
Well, deacons are intended not to replace pastors at all, but rather to multiply and to supplement the ministry of pastors. They're not meant as replacements. And certainly the deacons and their pastors see them as a supplement and a multiplication for their ministry. With that in mind, however, there are some deacons that serve almost like sole pastors in individual congregations. However, that's because trained pastors are not available in those locales. They may be remote places, they may be urban, they may have poverty, they stretch all the way from the deserts of California to the mountains of Alaska. And so in those places, deacons serve in a place in which pastors are not available. And yet, if you listen to the congregations and to their supervising pastors, it's very clear that they do a very good job of ministry in those congregations.
Aren't there extra pastors within the LCMS who are looking for a call?
Certainly there are some pastors who would like to have a call but do not. The problem is that they are not evenly distributed throughout Synod. And so very often the places in which pastors are most needed, whether that be remote areas or poor or urban, is not where those clergy happen to be. Plus, many of those clergy want to have a full-time paid position, and those churches are frequently unable to pay a pastor, except maybe some expenses or a very small stipend. And so deacons are doing ministry that pastors are unable, or rather unavailable to do. And it's a blessing to those congregations. It's also important to notice that there'll be an increase in need for deacons in coming years, not a decrease. Synod keeps warning us that as baby boomer pastors retire, there'll be very fewer pastors to replace them. In addition, many congregations are shrinking and aging, and so there'll be more need for deacons to serve in those unique and often small locations rather than less. On the end of the scale, there are very large churches in which a pastor or pastors are not able to handle the fullness of the ministry. And so deacons supplement their ministry, thereby multiplying the ministry in those large congregations and serving as a blessing there.
Do you oppose the proposal to use a colloquy program to upgrade some deacons to special ministry pastors?
Upgrading deacons who serve as sole pastors of congregations to special ministry pastors, I think, is a good idea. Now, how well it would be executed in practice, of course, depends on the colloquy committees themselves. Some committees may make it almost onerous for certain men at certain ages or locations to actually go through the program. So how well it works in practice depends on actually what those committees do as they interview particular deacons. The colloquy process could serve to really expand and make the ministry more effective, or it could serve as a hindrance. The problem with the task force recommendations is that as a package, what they did was to eliminate all deacon licenses in the country. If you followed through as a synod on their recommendations, it would mean that all deacons would disappear, not just that some would become SMPs. So that's the part that was most troubling to those places that ably use the ministry of deacons and see them bearing great fruit.
Clergy and laymen are two separate things. Doesn't the Lutheran Confessions prohibit lay people from preaching?
Now, what we see in the scriptures is deacon is an office of the church, sort of like a pastor is an office of the church, although there are two different offices. As such, you might say they are called by the congregation and are not laymen. Now, you might picture the public ministry of the church as being like an umbrella. And so within that umbrella, there's certainly the ministry of pastors and the ministry of deacons working together in the public ministry of the church for the benefit of many people.
You seem to look down on pastors and denigrate the office of the holy ministry. You've said that pastors' pride and desire for control are one of the reasons that deacons haven't been accepted everywhere.
When I talked about the pride of pastors, this creates a great deal of response from lay people. It's amazing, but it actually serves to increase their view of the clergy rather than decrease it. It's as though the lay people see the elephant in the room. They see the pride and the desire for control among so many pastors. And they're just gratified that a clergyman is willing to put that out in public and admit that this is a problem and that it hinders ministry. What I hope pastors will do in response to that is not just blindly defend the office of the public ministry as though you shouldn't question it, but rather that they would have some self-reflection instead, that they respond by saying, what do I do? Or do I have some attitudes that my lay people see as being prideful or as wanting control? Or maybe they should think back to the last conflict they had in the church and think, could some of my pride or desire for control have been part of this controversy? So that we as pastors would create some self-reflection so that we would put as far as we can from us pride or desire for control that hinders ministry. Now, if I were in a room in which there was lots of loose cash lying around or women in bikinis, I would say, I'm vulnerable to greed or lust in this situation and I need to defend myself from this. In the same way, pride or desire for control is an occupational hazard of clergymen, and we need to be very careful in order to avoid that problem and be transparent in admitting this weakness so that we can have a more healthy relationship with the people in our congregations.
We don't know exactly what the deacons did in the early church, so how can we know what to do with them today?
You know, it almost seems to me that some people have rejection by agnosticism. In a sense, they say, well, we don't know exactly what the biblical office of deacon was like, or the nature of deacon has changed or been different in different places, and so since we can't know, then we shouldn't have them. Well, I think a better assumption or guidelines would be to say, well, we have a broad description of deacons in the New Testament. There is variety in the church, and that's good because it answers different needs in different places. So we have enough of an idea of what deacons are like in the New Testament and can see them active among us, and so should affirm them rather than hinder them. And so it's important to see that broad description and then to recognize that it's among us today. We don't need an ultimate standard of proof and a great deal of detail in order to acknowledge that. Now, people sometimes ask pastors, can you prove the inspiration of the Bible, or can you prove that babies should be baptized? And the fact is, we can't prove those. I can make a very good case for Scripture being inspired. I can make a very good case that in the early church they baptized babies, but I can't point to a particular verse that says they took this 3-month-old and had them baptized. I can make a reasonable case for them, though, and I think a convincing one. But it's not going to convince everyone in every place. In the same way, we can make a very reasonable case for the biblical office of deacons existing today.
Synod allowed the deacons to preach only in emergency conditions where there is no clergy. It seems that today that pastors allow deacons to preach just if they want a day off.
I think what the resolution did say is that deacons could preach when pastors were unavailable, not just in emergencies, which sounds like such a strong word. Now, what we find is that deacons can serve as preachers when pastors aren't available in many different settings. Sometimes when a church cannot find a pastor for a given Sunday or for a more extended length of time. In large churches, some pastors have avoided burnout, especially when they have multiple services on Sundays and during the week. And deacons can help them survive and thrive in the ministry in that way. In a similar way, deacons are able to preach when pastors have medical problems, in which case they may be actually physically present but unable to preach. So there's many places and situations in which deacons can preach when pastors are unavailable, even though it may not fall into that strict demand of being emergency.
Deacons today go way beyond the intent of the original Wichita resolution, which allowed deacons only in very restricted settings.
The resolution did recognize the need for a deacon in different places, but didn't define exactly what that need would be, but rather that this was one way that the church could fill that. Now, it's been amazing to see that there's been some 600 deacons credentialed just in the last 30 years. This is a very large grassroots movement, and I believe God is at work behind that. Many of the works of God come out of the grassroots and spread rapidly without the acceptance or description of a hierarchy or the theological structures of the church. The Reformation itself began as a grassroots movement that never was accepted by the church hierarchy. The ministry, or rather the evangelism to the Greeks in the New Testament, spread rapidly before the church ever came to a definite theological rationale for it. God was at work in that way. And God is at work in a grassroots way, extending and multiplying the ministry of deacons.
The functions of deacons has varied considerably over the last few centuries, and different church bodies have a radically different view on what the function of a deacon is. How can we be sure of which view is correct?
It's true that there's a variety in the ministry of deacons over the centuries, but this is something that's good and to be expected, not something to be used as a proof against deacons today. Their ministry changes or their functions change according to the needs. This is also true of pastors. The ministry of pastors changes over time and is different in different places. And yet we don't say, well, they changed over the centuries and so we shouldn't have them today. Pastors, for instance, some cases don't preach at all. They may serve as counselors or as chaplains. Pastors in Europe are part of the state church, and so some of their functions are related to the state church. We wouldn't think of that among our pastors in America today. However, in America, we do perform marriages. That would be completely illegal in many countries of the world. And so functions of pastors vary, and they should according to needs. In the same way, the ministry of deacons varies as well. This is something we should embrace, not be afraid of.
Wouldn't it be helpful to have a working definition of deacons today?
Yes, it's good to have a broad overview of what deacons do, but we don't need to have a uniform, detailed description of deacons that is in effect every time and every place. Now, some people somehow think that the ministry of deacons must be an impossible thing to define. And yet, the districts that do have deacons today do have broad guidelines that describe the office of a deacon. So this is already a good starting point and guidelines that are already being followed in many parts of the Lutheran Church today.
When we walk together as a synod, shouldn't we do everything the same way?
It is good that we walk together in synod, and certainly we have common doctrine and practice. However, Even the constitution of synod allows for variety or diversity from one region to another in response to the needs that are there. Even the Apostle Paul gave an option to the churches, for instance, whether they wanted to eat food sacrificed to idols or not eat food sacrificed to idols, which he said was dependent upon the attitudes in those churches in which they were. In the same way, it's good to have a variety in the church today as well. And so, even if not all districts of synod want to use deacons, still those that do will benefit from that, and the wider church, the Lutheran Church at large, will benefit from their ministry. Well, we hope that these answers to these questions have helped people think through what deacons are and how they serve, and we look forward to continuing to see the ministries of deacons multiply and flourish in coming decades as God uses this grassroots movement of ministry to do his work in our world today. God bless you.